Everybody, this is Jesse Weber, and welcome to Law&Crime Network Live, our Q&A edition. This is where we take your questions about some of the biggest stories that we've been covering, and today we are continuing our coverage of Tiger King. We've been focusing a lot about this, and more specifically today, it's going to be about Joe Exotic, the main star of the Netflix documentary, Joseph Maldonado-Passage. As you know, he was convicted and ultimately sentenced to 22 years in prison for a litany of different crimes, including killing his tigers, falsifying records, and maybe most famously, a murder for hire plot, paying someone to kill his main rival, Carole Baskin. Now, his trial, which was in 2019, it lasted about a week. A lot of different thoughts about that trial. And today, we have the privilege of having one of those juror members here with us today. Her name is Kristen. She's going to be jumping on in a second, and we can't wait to have her. But before we do, I also want to let our viewers know that we have with us executive trial producer Kathy Russin. Kathy is going to be with us fielding your questions to Kristen. So whatever you want to ask, now is the time. Kathy, Kristen, it's great to have you both here. And Kristen, I want to start with you. I'm going to ask you the $1,000,000 question, or maybe I should say the $3,000 question, because that's what the government says that Joe Exotic paid someone to kill Carole Baskin. Why did you convict Joe Exotic?
Well, the documentary or docu-series is really not even close to what we saw in court. There were recordings that we got to hear where he actually hired the hitman. Actually, with the FBI agent, we could have convicted him on both counts of that just based on that one recording, because he had said that the first guy he hired to kill her ran off with his money, so he wanted to try again. So it's things like that that were not shown on the docu-series.
So in other words, was there anything that you saw in Tiger King, or maybe anything that you read after the trial that would have given you pause, or that might have said, maybe I wouldn't have convicted him of this count, or it really didn't change your perspective one way or another?
No, it didn't change anything at all. I am confident that we made the right decision.
What were the deliberations like? Were all the jury members on board from the beginning? Were there some that were on the fence? Were there some who felt sympathetic for him? I mean, what was it like being in that room?
For the most part, everybody agreed. The only we had a little bit of a hang up with it was, I believe there were 5 or 6 counts of illegally selling cubs. And so there was a count for selling them and a count for falsifying documents. And so there was one juror that didn't want to find him guilty on both things, but she finally looked at everything and was able to convict him.
But in other words, on the murder for hire plot of Carole Baskin, it seems that all the jury members were on the same page.
Yeah, there was one lady who she kind of questioned why he would hire Alan Glover, because he was obviously he had a drug problem and a drinking problem, and she wondered why he would hire somebody like him. And my opinion was that that's exactly who you would hire to kill somebody, because they'll do just about anything for money.
Well, here's the interesting thing, and then we're going to get to some viewer questions. If you watch the documentary and you listen to Joe Exotic, he believes that he was entrapped and that he was a victim of these 3 men, Alan Glover, Jeff Lowe, and this other individual who's a FBI informant, James Garretson. And these 3 individuals who were featured prominently in Tiger King, did you ever get a sense or feel that, wow, maybe I didn't get that full picture? I still would have convicted Joe Exotic, but I would have liked to know a little bit more about the role these 3 men played and how this was all unfolded? Or do you believe that, hey, it really didn't matter to me, it's the same thing?
I really wish we would have heard something from Jeff Lowe. He never testified. So in deliberations that was brought up that, you know, he never testified, so we didn't get to hear his opinion about anything or the exact role that he did play. But the other two, I think that we were given enough information about them that I don't think anything changed with the docu-series at all.
All right, well, let's get to some viewer questions because I have thousands of questions I could ask you, but I want to get to our viewers. Kathy, I know that you and Kristen know each other, so who better to ask these questions than you? So, Kathy, I'm going to let you jump in here. What's our viewer question? The first one we got up.
Okay, so first of all, this is a little crazy that Kristen and I go back to Casey Anthony trial, and viewers that are watching this right now are going to know what I'm talking about. We found each other along with a lot of other trial watchers on some of these message boards talking during that, and we were like fellow trial junkies. And so fast forward all these years later, and she ends up on this huge case. So my question, and then I will ask you a viewer question, Kristen, is when you were on this jury, I think it was a week-long trial, did you have any idea it was going to be high profile like this?
No, not at all. I think it was just short of 2 weeks. I was a little disappointed when it ended because I've always wanted to be on a trial, and this one had so many different aspects of it. So it was an experience, but I had no idea it would blow up into what it has at all.
That is funny that you said you always wanted to be on a trial, because I think all of us trial junkies feel that way. Okay, our own Linda Kinney Bodden, host at Law&Crime Network and famed criminal defense attorney, she wanted to know what the most compelling piece of evidence was, but I think you talked about the recordings, that they have recordings with him. So her second part to that is, what piece of evidence or testimony did you find lacking on the murder for hire plot?
I don't think there was anything lacking. I think that that everything was either in a document or in a recording or in a video. It was all, for those 2 counts, everything was kind of handed to us on a silver platter. So I don't think there was anything more that they needed.
Well, Kristen, let me ask you this. Big thing that we saw in the documentary was a lot of Joe Exotic, but you had the opportunity to see Joe Exotic take the stand. He testified in his own defense. What was it like seeing him testify? I mean, could you walk us through some of the bigger things that he said? And was the guy that you saw in that courtroom the same guy that we saw in the documentary?
No, he wasn't the same guy. He was much quieter. He did give his attorneys a run for their money because I think he would talk more than what they wanted him to, and they kept reminding him to only answer the question that they were asking him because he would slip in a little bit of extra information. He is not a very good fake crier. I was fairly close to him, probably maybe 12 feet away from him, and there were no tears. It was obvious that he wasn't actually crying, but he did give it a good shot.
Well, clearly it didn't work out so well for him. Before we go, Kathy, to the next question, I just want to let everybody know, if you're joining us, this is our Law&Crime Network live Q&A. We have an opportunity right now to break down with Kristen, who is one of the jurors on Joe Exotic's trial in 2019. We're taking your questions right now. And I see a lot of questions, Kathy. I see a lot of questions blowing up for Kristen right now. What's another one we have lined up?
Yes, and I'm totally laughing at not a good fake crier, because we say that about every defendant that gets on the stand. All right. Were there any random outbursts? I mean, I guess you said he was fairly tame. So was there any moment where you're like, oh?
Not from him. Alan Glover got a little frustrated. I don't remember the line of questioning at all, but he kind of leaned up in his chair and got a little, I don't want to say aggressive, but he was obviously upset. And I think right then is when the judge decided it was time for us to take a break. So we didn't see anything past that. When we came back from our break, he had calmed down. But I can't remember anybody else really, any outbursts or anything.
So, Kristen, I have a question for you. You're part of the phase where you determined if Joe Maldonado-Passage is actually guilty or not, but you weren't a part, a jury was not a part of the sentencing. When you heard that he was sentenced to 22 years in prison, there are clearly people who feel that is way too excessive, and then there are people who say, no, based upon what he was convicted of, that's appropriate. When you heard 22 years, what'd you think?
I feel like 22 years is fair. When you hear more of the details about the animal abuse, that's where I think he could have even maybe got a little bit more time. But I thought 22 years was fair overall.
Yeah, I want to get in the middle of what we're going to see for the future of Joe Exotic. But Kathy, let's go to another viewer question lined up.
Okay, so a little bit to what Jesse said. There's a question from a viewer that if you have any thoughts on why the public has decided to come out so strongly in support of Joe. And let me just put in my own 2 cents. I watched the whole series and I'm not in support of him, but there is a huge movement that is. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think people need to remember that it was more like a docudrama than a documentary. They didn't give all of the evidence at all. The jury wouldn't have convicted him based on what the average viewer saw. So it's easy to feel sorry for him, but they didn't get to see what we saw. They didn't get to hear the recordings and just all of the videos that they showed of his hatred for her, and I think that if they had seen more, they could understand more.
Well, what did you hear about, speaking of her, what did you hear about Carole Baskin during the course of the trial? We know that in the Netflix documentary, a big portion of it was dedicated to this theory that Carole Baskin was somehow responsible for the disappearance of her husband, Don Lewis, in fact, saying that perhaps she killed him. Did you hear anything about that during the course of the trial? And if not, when you heard all about these rumors surrounding Carole Baskin afterwards, is that something that you would have wished that you heard during the course of the trial?
No, we didn't hear anything about him at all during the trial. I don't know that it would have made any difference if we would have. I personally didn't care for her either. I didn't really have sympathy for her. She kind of antagonized him a little bit, and there were videos that we saw where she wasn't innocent in all of the internet things. She would say things and do things too, and he just took it a step farther. But she wasn't a complete victim in the whole thing. She antagonized him for sure, even from the stand she did. So I just don't think that any other information would have changed anything.
All right, Kathy, let's go to another question from one of our viewers here we have Kristen, one of the jurors who sat on the Joe Exotic jury. So let's go to another question.
Well, let's go to, and I was wondering about this too, and this has to do with, we've got a few questions about the abuse against the animals, the tigers specifically. So in the docu-series, that was kind of glossed over a little bit, and maybe in the end you saw more of that. But talk about how that came out in trial. What did you see? What did you hear about? In the jury room, what were reactions from jurors about the animal abuse?
The animal abuse was, I think, the worst part of the trial. We did talk about it a little bit, but deliberations, I think it was about 3.5 hours. So we didn't talk about a ton of things. It was mostly just going over the charges. I think the worst part about the animal abuse, that's how the trial actually started, was by talking about, it was Eric, I believe his last name is Cowley, but I'm not sure. He, I think, was the first one that took the stand, and he talked about how close he was to the tigers, and he even started crying when he talked about one of them. One of the tigers that he was really close to was one of the 5 that Joe killed and buried on his property. And that was touching. That was really sad to see that, because he was really close to him.
And Kathy, let's go to another viewer question, because I see our board is blowing up with a lot of people who want to find out more about this case.
Okay, so this just happened yesterday. A viewer wants to know, do you know that President Trump was asked about a possible pardon for Joe Exotic? What we do know is Joe has written him from prison. But during a press conference yesterday, a reporter asked him about it, and Trump said, "I'll look into it." What do you think about that?
Well, I'd be surprised if he actually looked into it, but I did see that, and he didn't seem to know who he was. He guessed which one of his sons had been watching it and knew more about it. But I kind of think he said it just to move on to the next question, actually.
Well, I guess just to follow up, if there's a chance that he were to be pardoned, or if there was a chance, Kristen, that he gets out early, I know his parole is in 2034. Do you think that would be, what would your reaction be to that? Because it's kind of countering what you and the rest of the jurors decided. You found him guilty across the board. And if his punishment is kind of cut in half or he's pardoned, how would you react to that?
Well, I absolutely respect the process. So if something did happen where he was pardoned, there was a reason for it, and I would understand. Same thing as if his sentence was cut short. It's all part of the process, and you just have to trust that it works.
Kathy, let's go to another viewer question here for Kristen.
Well, viewer / host of Law&Crime Network, Terry Austin wants to know how the judge handled the trial. How did you feel he handled it? Did he seem to favor one side over the other?
Oh, he was a very fair judge. I thought he handled it very well. I have nothing bad at all to say about him.
So you didn't see anything that it was biased towards the prosecution, that he was a little, or that the judge was too harsh towards Joe Exotic or the defense team, nothing like that?
No, not at all. He didn't have to, make many rulings during it. There were a few objections, but it wasn't anything like I would have expected it to be. I felt like he was very respectful to everybody.
The big thing about this, and it's interesting, Kristen, is that there was a documentary made about him. They made Tiger King about him, and I guess the effort, they clearly thought that he was going to be a source of entertainment and the public would get a kick out of this. Do you think, I'm just curious, after everything you saw during the course of the trial, you think it was appropriate to create a documentary surrounding Joe Exotic? Because there's one thing for a documentary to bring light on a subject that a lot of people didn't know about. But as we talked about throughout this interview, a big consequence of this is that people feel sympathy for Joe Exotic, and yet he is a convicted felon now.
I think that the docu-series did a big disservice to the way that criminal justice is supposed to be carried out. It makes the jury look like we were incompetent and that we convicted him on basically nothing, when it wasn't like that at all. I really wish that they would have been more fair with what they showed, but it is what it is, and all we can do is hope people understand that that's not exactly the way a trial is.
All right, that's fair enough. I mean, it's very different to be in that courtroom versus being a viewer of a Netflix series. Kathy, we got some more questions?
They're rolling in, Kristen. You did talk a little bit about how you were disappointed that Jeff Lowe didn't testify. The question from our viewer is, what was discussed during the trial in regards to Jeff Lowe and his involvement, and did you discuss more about him in the jury room?
I think the only thing that came up in the jury room was why he didn't testify, but I mean, we couldn't even guess because we had absolutely no idea. He was brought up during the trial as far as Joe tried to say that he was the reason that that he hired Alan and that he was the go-between and that he was the one that got him this fake ID and this burner phone and all these different things, when the actual documents that we saw showed that Joe did it.
Kathy, let's see if we can try to get another question in.
What did they talk about during the trial? The threats that Joe made about Waco, about it being another Waco. And he was always about the guns and blowing stuff up and don't come in here, I'm armed. What were your feelings about that?
I don't really recall anything like that during the trial. I think that he wanted to present it as his own kingdom and that he was the ruler of the kingdom. And I think that the jury kind of saw right through that. We didn't have this.
Well, yeah, they saw that he wasn't the Tiger King. That's the thing. And Kristen, I know unfortunately, our time is coming to an end, but we really do appreciate you jumping on. Kathy, thanks for fielding the questions. I thank all of our viewers for coming on. And really, what an incredible, incredible interview. Kristen, thank you so much. We will be back. Everyone, stay safe. We'll be returning.